IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and a very happy Independence Day to everyone listening to us in India. This is a special episode of All Things Policy, your favorite daily public policy podcast. And today on Independence Day in India, we thought we'd discuss something that is closely related to the idea of independence and that has been very, very dear in terms of Indian foreign policy thinking since 1947 and perhaps even before that. But it continues to be something very, very dear, which is the concept of strategic autonomy. My name is Manoj Kevalramani. I head the Indo-Pacific Studies program at Takshashila Institution. So a lot of my work is around geopolitics and the rise of China. I'm joined today by three colleagues, Anushka Saxena, Bharat Sharma, and Amit Kumar, all three of whom work with the Indo-Pacific Studies program and wrestle with questions of Indian foreign policy, China's rise, India's relationships with the United States, and so on and so forth. And I'm really curious to ask all of them what they think about this idea of strategic autonomy and in what it means in their views and how they see India's foreign policy evolving and whether this concept means anything or is it just one of those terms which continues to be bandied about with very little context and very little depth associated with it. So we're going to try and explore that. And again, we're going to try and see if we can make sense of Indian foreign policy through the discussion of this term. So guys, welcome to this conversation.
Thank you, Manoj. Happy to be here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Manoj. Happy to be here.
All right. I'm going to begin by coming to each one of you with a very, very simple question, which is what on earth is strategic autonomy to you? What does it mean to you when the Indian foreign minister, when scholars and journalists and academics use this term saying that India has historically sought strategic autonomy and it holds this extremely dear? So I want to understand from you guys, what do you define strategic autonomy as? And why do you think India has historically sought strategic autonomy? I want to begin by going to Amit. What's your view on this?
Thanks, Manoj. Thanks for the question. So in the context of, as I understand it, in the context of international politics, strategic autonomy would mean the extent of autonomy a state has or a state exercises to maximize its national interests that is pursuing both power and security. And of course, we use the term autonomy and not independence to recognize that there are certain necessary constraints under which every state in the realm of international politics acts or reacts. And there's not a complete independence while making choice, and that there are certain restrictions and restraints. And therefore, there are always compromises and concessions that a state has to make while deciding the best in its national interest. Thus, the idea of strategic autonomy is to maximize national interest while operating within those certain constraints. So, of course, the first feature is that it's contextual. Second feature that I can think of in particular context of this term, strategic autonomy, that it is a term that is usually used for middle powers. Strategic autonomy as a concept would not be used for countries like, at least to my sense, for countries like US or China, which are acting as the two primary poles in the current international order. Therefore, countries that find themselves between these two poles would be the ones on which the idea of a strategic autonomy would be applied. So that's a brief understanding of strategic autonomy.
That's interesting. So you seem to define it within the context of an order which is perhaps, at least at present, is emerging to seem like some sort of bipolarity, but there could be more poles. But so the necessary constraints that you're looking at are around your relationships with what you may middle powers relationships with what may be great powers, right? And how great powers can influence middle power policies and having autonomy of action regardless of their influence, right? If I got that correct in a nutshell. Okay, cool. Bharat, I wanted to come to you. Do you agree with that, or is there something more to this idea?
I think I agree with Amit. I'll probably say it in a different way. I think in the international sphere, all states, seek to increase or maximize the chances of survival. And one way that states can do that is by aligning themselves with numerous actors, not just one particular actor. And I think what that gives you, the ability to, or the capability to align yourself with different actors gives you, enlarges your wiggle room of acting and the decisions you take. So you don't align with or are committed to one particular actor in the hope that aligning with several actors increases your chances of survival or action in the international sphere. So that seems to be India's mode of operation. So I will not just align with the US. I will keep that wiggle room open to be able to interact with other actors that gives me some kind of benefit in the international sphere across a wide range of domains. And we'll come later to whether it actually does mean that your wiggle room is expanded. That's a different question. But I think the logic is that, yes, I am able to align myself with numerous actors. It does increase my chances of survival rather than aligning myself with one pole. So that seems to be the idea that India adopts, which is that, yes, this is how, we want to maximize our chances. It's through, independence of some sort in the international sphere.
Right. So in terms of how you're defining it is essentially within the context of this idea that the Indian establishment today talks about, which is multi-alignment, right? The ability to be able to work with anybody without, sort of fear or favor based on your interest, and constantly is trying to seek that wiggle room, particularly amid pressure from great powers. But at a certain point of time in history, strategic autonomy was also defined as the choice to not at all align with anybody, and we tried to create this third front through non-alignment. So there was also this choice of not aligning with anybody, right, to try to stay away from anything. So it can probably mean either things, to have the freedom to not align, but the freedom to also multi-align, which sounds a little bit like old wine in new bottle, but there is a subtle difference in there somewhere, I think. Anushka, do you think there is a subtle difference in there, or do you have a whole new definition for strategic autonomy for us?
Thanks, Manoj. I think there are a lot of moving parts to the idea of strategic autonomy, including what India thinks it has achieved in the contemporary context and what the reality is. So I do agree with some of the points you made in there, especially with regards to not the subtle, but the rather wide difference between non-alignment and multi-alignment. But yes, I do have some ideas of my own to propose. So I think if you'd ask me what strategic autonomy really means, I think in its purest form, it has to have a power equation. It would mean that you have such overwhelmingly superior power as a state that you can achieve sovereign interests, you can make national decisions of national importance without feeling pressured by any external actors or events and environments, right? And I think the Indian journalist Shrimoy Talukdar, she has a very succinct definition for it, and I largely agree with it, which is the exercise of choice driven purely by sovereign considerations and interest. And about what India looks at it like, and how does India approach it, and whether or not India really is kind of strategically autonomous today, I would say that some of it, especially some of how Indian policymakers or scholars would define it, comes from the hangover idea of non-alignment. And when we say that historically India had non-alignment, we see the reasons for seeking that was that neither the US or the Soviet Union posed a direct threat to us, and they did not emerge as natural partners against who our real threats were, which was either China or Pakistan. And one of the other primary reasons for why we sought non-alignment in the past or strategic autonomy today is that we don't want to be entangled in other sovereign countries' conflicts. So the fear of entanglement, along with the decision to not make a decision, I think those were the reasons why we were non-aligned in the past. But I think as the Cold War has faded away and non-alignment has become a thing of the past, we have evolved from that ideology to the idea of strategic autonomy. And in the current context, I think strategic autonomy is achieved better than by isolating ourselves from all the poles in the multilateral order instead of that, we actually achieve it better through a deep set of strategic partnerships partnerships with friends and allies that help us insulate our sovereign decision making from threats or challenges which we perceive as most important today. And in that regard, how I would define the current situation is that we truly don't have strategic autonomy, but we do have decisional autonomy, which has become synonymous with what you said, multi-alignment or issues-based alignment, which is also how our external affairs minister defines our foreign policy approach. And again, like I said, it's different from non-alignment because it is firstly not ideological in nature, and it is driven purely by sovereign interests, which may not require a consideration of isolation, but rather deep partnerships. And just to add to one point, I personally don't think that the idea of strategic autonomy doesn't apply to superpowers or the two poles of the current global order, because only a lone superpower in a unipolar international order will have true strategic autonomy. Otherwise, say in the context of US and China today, US would still want to maximize its sovereign interests against a perceived threat. And so its strategic autonomy will be relative, but its fundamental goal will still be strategic autonomy. So I think it applies to all countries, and ultimately, because at the core of it, it's about resisting pressure or exercising autonomy in decision making without pressure from the international environment.
Okay, so you've thrown in a lot of little things there, which from a historical perspective also, a lot of which I don't agree with, but I'm probably going to leave a lot of that for our discussions in the office. But, I like the fact that your definition of strategic autonomy, to be able to act without pressure, to be able to resist any and every pressure and to be able to act. To me, to a certain degree, even in the unipolar decades of the 1990s and the early 2000s, I don't think the United States had that. Or I would contest that the United States didn't have that, So even at its zenith, for example, yes, it could do certain things, but it faced significant pressure. And those pressures eventually yielded costs, which ended up eroding its unipolarity. For example, if you go back to the Iraq war, you will see significant pushback. So yes, they did act invariably, but they acted without UN sanction and so on and so forth. So and also, in the 1990s, what we saw was that the United States, because of the desires to construct an order, had to give in on multilateralism, had to give in on institutional creation, and had to subjugate itself also to institutional norms, which again, today it's trying to pull back from, in the last 5, 7, 10 years, it's sort of pull back from some of these things. In some domains, it did not give in, but in some domains, it did give in. So, that's why you see a debate within the US Congress about, hey, look, the world has taken us for a ride, sort of stuff, right? So I think that if that's the definition of strategic autonomy, then perhaps even the greatest of powers don't have it. Only the most belligerent of the greatest of powers perhaps do have it. And even then they have to accommodate for many things. So perhaps we need to have a definition which is a little bit more, which allows some space for action, right? But I also do agree with you. I think that, even the smallest of states, smallest of powers will have to a certain degree autonomy, and which they can cultivate by hedging with different actors or through the means of institutions, international institutions, and working through them. So they can create space for themselves and autonomy for action because they are working through them. On the Cold War, there's lots of things that I disagree with, but I'll not get into all of that. Otherwise, we'll be here all day. But I don't think that we necessarily didn't engage. I would actually argue that India was much more actively engaged in the world and in conflicts of third parties in the 1950s than we have ever been since then. So despite having little strategic autonomy, we were doing much more. Now, whether that was a good thing, whether that was an interest is a secondary issue. But compared to today, we were probably much more engaged in the world. So with that said, I'm going to move on without trying to spend too much more time on this. Yeah, so that the next question that I had in mind was essentially this, that, what does it take for a state? And I think you guys have answered this to some degree, but you guys have talked about the need for power. What do you mean when you say power? And, what are the factors that go into a state having strategic autonomy without assuming that it is, let's say, a unipolar world order? Let's assume that the world is as it is today, where dispersion of power is quite uneven. What does it take? What are the attributes that a state must have to achieve strategic autonomy? Anushka, let me begin with you.
Right. So, like I said, fundamentally, I would like to reiterate the point that I made about having partnerships. So I think strategic autonomy is a function of not only the kind of power a country possesses and its extent of application, but also what is the context or the structure of the international order. So in the Cold War, it would mean, in the Cold War era, it would mean something else, but in the current context, it can mean something else. And in the current context, I would say as much as there is value to the application of economic and military hard power in achieving strategic autonomy, there is also one third significant element of power, which is deep strategic partnerships with friends and allies, which I think is personally for me especially relevant to the Indian context and the Indian approach to strategic autonomy, because of course there is a wing of scholars that argues that, say, our decision to engage with the US more deeply on defense, on nuclear weapons, or on, say, the recently signed Artemis Accords, which opens us up to alignment with the US in a upcoming strategic space for conflict, which is outer space. All of this hurts our strategic autonomy because it means alignment with the US. But for me, that's a source of power to maintain our strategic autonomy against, and I mentioned this previously also, our main challenge or area of threat, which is China. And apart from that, I think also in the evolving geopolitical context, access to and some degree of control or power over cutting edge technologies has become vital to securing future power or nodes of power if it does come to kind of competition or rivalry in warfare, in health. Access to cutting edge technologies and power over cutting edge technologies has become vital to all of these fundamental interests, some of which are really critical to national security. So that has become a fundamental node in the idea of strategic autonomy in the current geopolitical context. So those would be two extra factors.
Right, fascinating. So, Amit, I want to come to you. Anushka has basically put out certain broad factors, right? So, economic power, military power, partnerships, and allies. Allies, in the traditional terms, perhaps will also have demands which will impinge on your autonomy of action. And of course, technologies and access to that, which again, all of this, even military power, expansion of all of this comes with interlinkages which impinge on autonomy of action, right? So, for example, in an interdependent world economy, even with your adversary, there is only so much that you can perhaps do because it impacts your economic development also. Likewise, as you become militarily closer to somebody, and particularly if your weapon systems are bought from them and reliant on their technology, that also can perhaps inhibit or limit your scope of action. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that. Do you agree with those factors, or do you think there's more that is needed to cultivate strategic autonomy? And is it that as you cultivate these factors or these sources of power with certain partners, that necessarily will also come at certain costs of autonomy of action?
I agree with Anushka to the extent wherein she says that the tools of strategic autonomy, if one has to define, it has to be based on hard power and soft power. Soft power, basically culture, as Joseph pointed out, culture, political values, and foreign policy. And the cultural influence a country has had in the past, the kind of political values a country ascribes to, and the legitimacy that that country gets in ascribing to those political values. And lastly, how it engages with the outside world, especially its neighbors. And these are the kind of things that I think lend a certain degree of legitimacy and credence to the policies and decisions of a country, which in turn provide room for exercising strategic autonomy. And of course, it has to be backed by the hard power, military and economic power. But I would say there is one more factor, critical factor, that is necessary for a country to be able to maximize or to use its strategic autonomy in a very efficient way. And that would be, for me, the need or the value that the world sees in that particular actor. If the world at large views that one particular actor, for instance, just say India in the current scenario, has a value that it brings to the table in how the issues are framed, how the larger frictions in the world are resolved, and if they see that there's a value that this particular actor brings on table, and I think that is one complementary factor that gives you more bargaining power and the room to exercise this strategic autonomy.
All right. So the world must also see some value in what you can bring to the table. And perhaps part of that is also a product of, I mean, sometimes it's just a product of size, right? I mean, you have to be large enough for the world to be interested in you. You can talk less louder. So in that sense, I think India might have some, advantages. But Anushka, yeah, if you had your hand up, a brief intervention, then I can move to Bharat.
Yeah, just briefly to kind of point out something on what you said about how, say, access to technology from allies and partners would kind of create and impinge upon create restrictions or impinge upon one's own strategic autonomy. I think the European Union defines themes like "Make in India" or "Make in China" or any sort of protectionist policies as strategic autonomy. So I think one element of strategic autonomy could also be self-reliance, which ultimately means that you're self-capable to meet all your needs, which makes you ultimately powerful enough to not have to bow down to the needs of others and to depend on others. So I think the fundamental framework of alliances would be contrary to defining strategic autonomy from the perspective that you don't want to depend on others for your needs. So I think there is a subtle balance between both of them, which actually formulates strategic autonomy than rather just being completely free of dependence, which is again impossible in the current world order, or being so entrenched with partnerships that you have nothing, as Amit said, to offer on your own accord.
All right. Okay. So we've now gotten to the fact that dependence to a certain degree is just a fact of life, and we have to live with it. Bharat, turning to you on this issue of what is it that a country needs to cultivate to consider, for example, Norway. Does it have strategic autonomy? I mean, it's quite active in many ways in international affairs. It's been a norm entrepreneur in some ways. Do you need to have this gamut of powers to be strategically autonomous in terms of your decision making, or it depends on the context within which you're operating? Bharat?
I think you need to have that gamut of powers. I mean, as you said, I think the world, it will have a certain degree of a dependence at all times. You will never reach a state where a state can say that, I have what I need. I don't need the world to, give me, I don't know, energy or, military supplies. There will always be a degree of dependence that you have on the world. And I think, which is why one would have to have the ideological kind of wiggle room to say that, yes, I will work with, numerous partners on issues that are key to me. Issues-based alignment is I think one way in which we can most directly kind of define strategic autonomy. And I think directly coming to what you asked, what does India need to be strategically autonomous? I think there are numerous factors that kind of go into answering that question. But I think one is that diplomatic ability. I think just trying to understand what is my interest and what is the world's interest. When I'm working with, let's say, Vietnam on some issue, how can I work with Vietnam? What are my interests and what are Vietnam's interests, and the ability to negotiate. I think because if you're defining strategic autonomy as the ability to align with others on issues that matter to you, I think you need to have the capability to be able to reach a decision, meeting halfway regarding a key issue or something like that. So I think diplomatic ability is something that most directly kind of influences your ability to, negotiate in the sea of kind of actors we have in international sphere. We might argue that India does not have that capability. A lot of scholars on India-China relations have argued that India does not have the infrastructure to think about negotiating with China, for example. It does not have the diplomatic, ability, like in terms of personnel, to actually kind of, man or think about these issues. So yeah, I think just the diplomatic capability is something that I would say gives India that strategic autonomy, along with a host of factors. Economic power, military power to some extent.
I think that's a really valuable point, right? Diplomatic capacity. We don't often think about this as seriously as we should. Just in terms of the number of outposts that you have, the number of diplomats that you have, the specializations within the diplomatic corps, the amount of money that is being spent on diplomacy, particularly in terms of capacity building, is truly important. Just to throw out some numbers out there, I think our total outlay for diplomacy this year in 2023 budget was 18,000 crore, which is up from 17,250 last year onwards. So there has been gradual increase in this budget, but it's still far, far away. A lot of it is, it's in terms of external support to certain countries, particularly in our neighborhood. But yeah, we need to do a lot more in terms of just the size of the diplomatic corps. It needs to go up if you want to become a major power, and your capability to be able to engage with and this is probably slightly self-serving given that we are a think tank that works on some of these issues, but your capability to engage with external actors within the ecosystem of policy is extremely important, so that you, particularly experts, right? Yeah, Bharat, please go ahead.
I think just wanted to add that it's not just, I think, about pragmatic issues when we think about strategic autonomy. I think it's also to some extent ideologically, I think how are you primed towards the world? Are you open to negotiation? Are you open to thinking about the fact that, yes, you will need to depend on other countries for a wide variety of issues? I think so. The ideological kind of inclination, I think, is also important when we speak about India.
All right, fascinating. I wanted to actually pick up from that point only and actually go one step further, because all of us have defined in this conversation strategic autonomy fundamentally as something about warding off dependencies, having autonomy of action, being largely able to be free to do certain things that you think are important to yourself, and being free from pressures. To be able to do that and to be able to be that free, you need to cultivate some of these sources of power and then exercise them. And in one point, we even discussed things like self-reliance, right? So essentially, we've taken autonomy from the perspective of strengthening, warding off pressures and doing those kinds of things. I'm quite curious what you guys think of, the creation of institutions and norms and demanding and sort of entrepreneuring them and sort of, publicizing them and requiring powers that may be much more states or countries that may be much more powerful than you to adhere to those norms, thereby constraining their actions and thereby expanding your autonomy of action or your say in the international arena. Are we looking at institutions and international norms as valuable to strategic autonomy, or are they inimical because while they may constrain China or a United States to a certain degree, they constrain you perhaps much more because it is China and the United States that command much more power? So yeah, I wanted to get your thoughts on the idea of, can institution building, multilateral institution building, be a tool for cultivating strategic autonomy, or is it actually inimical to it? Bharat, I want to start with you. Any thoughts on this?
Sure. So I think that the norms building does help you attain that freedom, because I think that institutions are built in the light of certain actors. You could argue that the United Nations system or the kind of current system we have was built in the aftermath of the Second World War. So you do see a very clear kind of impact of who the powers were at that time. And you could argue that those institutions are kind of do not help kind of actors who were not part of that process to not attain their foreign policy goals, for example. So you might say that, for example, the P5 system at the UN, you could say that the actors who do not have access to that kind of ability are constrained in the international sphere. So I think that multilateral institutions are built keeping certain aims in mind. I mean, this is arguable. And I think that the ability to craft a multilateral institution that's built on, of course, consensus and norms that are kind of agreeable to everyone, that kind of gives you that autonomy. So the current system, for example, I don't think it's crafted for India. That's, I think, a fact that China perhaps agrees to. It does think that it needs to change the world and the multilateral institutions according to its own preferences. So yeah, I mean, it really depends on how that crafting looks like, how it is possible to agree on issues that matter to you as well as to a host of other actors. Yeah.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
All right, so Bharat is somewhat an internationalist like me. I want to turn to the realist, anarchic world order upholder, Anushka, and ask her whether she believes in this sort of internationalism.
Well, you asked whether international institutions are kind of inherent or inimical to the idea of strategic autonomy. I would say it's ironic, actually, because so we say that the US is a significant norm entrepreneur when it comes to some of the multilateral institutions. We, say the name of as soon as we think of multilateralism, for example, the United Nations. But then you took the Iraq example, and that kind of explains how this very significant norm entrepreneur has comfortably flouted some of the rules, say perhaps we associate as having been built by the US, and kind of run roughshod over them. And we don't just see this with, say, taking permission of the UNSC for launching an invasion or something of the sort, but also in the WTO, where a lot of these sanctions, say, against China have been regarded by the WTO as flouting norms of free trade as established by the trade organization. And I would say the exercise of strategic autonomy then in this context is the comfort with which the US is able to take decisions according to the evolving nature of its definition of national security, whether or not they comply with the same ideas perhaps the US may have pioneered in some of these multilateral institutions. And from our perspective, it's ironic because it's not the international institution that will come to your aid or will be your platform to advocate for strategic autonomy, but rather the partnerships with some of the leading stakeholders in the multilateral institution. And I emphasized on partnerships before, that kind of determines whether or not you have the capability to act strategically autonomous. For example, your increasing kind of closeness with the United States will help you have a greater voice in, say, the United Nations Security Council. I don't know, that hasn't really worked out for us, but could be one of the ways in which you can gain a more voice in some of these international institutions. But it certainly, to me, doesn't seem to be that these institutions alone contribute to or take away from your strategic autonomy. I think it's the actors that influence the norm building in these institutions that do.
Ever the state-centric world order supporter, Anushka, who believes that institutions essentially are made up of its constituents, and its constituents matter more than the institutional structure. Of course, she's a hardcore realist. You can make that out now. Amit, I wanted to come to you finally and ask, do you agree with what Bharat and Anushka have said? They've obviously offered two somewhat opposite views. Do you think institutions matter in expanding strategic autonomy, or they actually hurt strategic autonomy because the more you are engaged, the more perhaps restrictions there are on your scope of action?
So this exact same debate also exists in the realists versus liberals theory of international relations, right? When the idea of liberal institutions were put forth, the realists argued that these international organizations are nothing but a guard behind, or a veil behind which these powerful states hide. And these are actually the mechanisms or institutions through which they try to push their agenda and make their actions more legitimate, have a consensus-based, etc. But liberals have a very interesting counter to this argument, and that is that they agree that most of these institutions have been built by the powerful states, wherein they occupy the powerful positions. And given that, there's an increased likelihood that they would actually use these stages and the platforms to further their agenda. Given all of this, the extent of power or the hegemonic influence that they would exercise in presence of these international institutions will still be less than what they would exercise in the absence of those international organizations. So I think there's certainly the existence of international organizations do inhibit and do check some of the powers that these hegemonic states or powerful great powers would enjoy in the absence of these platforms. But again, I have to agree with Anushka that this is in theory, and given the state of order currently, the UN, WTO, WHO, I mean, states do still get out with they get away with their things, right? So I think states will have, I mean, there's a role for international organizations, but it also is incumbent upon the states to effectively make use of those organizations. And I think they're both equally important in how they'll be able to, use their strategic or exercise their strategic autonomy.
Right. Okay. Interesting. So essentially, we are all saying that there is value in these institutions. Obviously, we ascribe different levels of that value and in different ways in which that value can be derived. But I think we all agree that there is value in these institutional systems which can help from perspective of, say, in India to expand its autonomy, whether it's because it's partnerships, whether it's because the norms of the institutions, or whether it's because those institutions constrain great powers, and as a middle power, India perhaps has far more space for action than because you have some constraining effect on great powers. My final question to all of you, and this is a two-part question, and I want you guys to give me very brief 1 minute answers, not more than that, because I think we've delved into lots of things already and we could go on for a very long time, but I want to just get brief answers. It is, given that we've discussed what strategic autonomy is, how do states generate it, what is the use of institutions and partnerships and all of this, has India ever really had strategic autonomy? I presume from Anushka's definition of it, which was that degree of freedom of action, perhaps not, but I would want to hear from her. And if India has had strategic autonomy in the past, if you could tell me which moment it was exercised and where. And given the world today, is this something that we should really bother about, that we need to cultivate strategic autonomy? Or is it that we need to be, if push comes to shove, and if we need to put our eggs in some baskets, we just need to? So I wanted to end with that. So first, I'll go to Anushka because I'm curious to hear what she thinks about whether India has ever had strategic autonomy, and today, is pursuit of strategic autonomy something that is of value, or should our pursuit be something else? Anushka.
Thanks, Manoj. So I think I'll circle back to the point you made about us having been embroiled in conflicts in other parts of the world in the 50s, much more than we have been at any point since then, and kind of try and fit that in the broad definition of strategic autonomy, in the sense that, yes, while I did argue that the idea of strategic autonomy in Indian thinking today comes from the idea of that was propagated during non-alignment, which is that we have a fear of entanglement, even if we didn't act on it or if we avoided entanglement. But we still see that despite kind of maintaining that idea of non-alignment, not being associated with any blocks, we exercised it multiple times. For example, during the 1962 war, we did reach out to the US for emergency aid and military supplies, right? And then after American military aid to India was suspended during the Indo-Pakistan war, we kind of fostered a defense pact with Moscow in the 1971 Indo-Pakistan war. So yes, throughout maintaining the idea of non-alignment, which I would say in the historical context would be closest to our idea of strategic autonomy, although not issues based but ideological, we have indeed taken up the option of siding with different partners, sometimes who have been on the diametrically opposed end of the table, to fulfill our own sovereign interests and to navigate around our threats and our threat perception. I think that would be one approach I would take to your question. And as to whether or not we should seek it, I think, as we've discussed and concluded by now, strategic autonomy is a fundamental objective that all countries, including superpowers, really want to possess, because it's a manifestation of your ability to make decisions in your national interest and possessing the right amount of power and influence in the global order to be able to do so. And of course, power matters, and strategic autonomy is a direct function of that. So yes, India is right to seek it, but India might not be right to say that we are truly strategically autonomous, which we have claimed multiple times in the past decade. And because even the US has relative strategic autonomy and not definite or absolute, because its norms are now being challenged by, as Amit argued, an emerging pole. So I think it would be wrong to claim that we're strategically autonomous, but it's right to be on the path to kind of achieve that. Now we do that by being purely self-sufficient or by balancing self-sufficiency with alliances. That remains to be seen. So yeah, thanks.
All right. Okay. Bharat, I want to come to you the same question. Has India ever been really, has there been a moment that you can see and say, aha, this is where I can say India has enjoyed strategic autonomy? And is it something that we should be pursuing today as part of our sort of objectives in terms of global engagement?
Manoj, you've given us 1 minute to answer $2 billion questions. So I think I think we have to create a differentiation between kind of two ideas. I think what the non-alignment movement was about was an ideological movement. I think it was less about, okay, here are pragmatic ways, we can exercise our autonomy. I think it was also about the fact that states in a system should have independence. I think it was a normative, ideological kind of idea. So in that sense, I think India has always exercised strategic autonomy. In kind of praxis, we might say, no, it hasn't. You might say in the Cold War, it kind of heavily kind of aligned with the Soviet Union. But I think just the idea of non-alignment, the idea that we are autonomous in an international system, in a system where there are two superpowers, let's say I'm taking the example of the Cold War. I think in that sense, just ideologically, I think India has always had it. Now, as I said, I mean, now when you go to praxis, I don't know. I think that's a more muddled question. With a muddled answer. And I think the second question you asked was whether we should seek it today. I think it does have value, but I think it also I think we need to realize that it should not mean kind of self-reliance. I think, as I said it before, that we should realize that, I mean, dependence is a fact of the world, and I think it will kind of lead to giving concessions, some kind of bargaining, some kind of negotiation. So I think strategic autonomy, I mean, the way we define it, I think should probably change. I think it should mean that, yes, we are dependent on the world, and it does mean that we will have to concede to certain things. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much for, given that if I ever have the amount of money that you spoke about, given that you stuck well within around the time frame that I had, at least a $1.1 billion is due. So I'll keep that in mind. Amit, so Bharat makes the point that, look, Anushka says that, yes, we need to think of self-sufficiency. Bharat says that, well, self-sufficiency might not necessarily be the way to go. Interdependence is essentially a fact of life. And I presume that you would suggest that we should create some sort of a flowchart based test which says that interdependence must not turn into vulnerabilities of certain kinds. But yeah, I don't want to put words in your mouth. I want to ask you, what do you think? Do you think India has ever had strategic autonomy? And is there a moment that epitomizes that? And is this something that we should be pursuing?
So at the outset, I would like to just make it clear that, I believe that there's a moment wherein India did exercise this idea of strategic autonomy in the past, and that was during the Cold War years. And therefore, it is essential to bring out the distinction between non-aligned movement and the non-aligned policy. So while non-alignment movement was the one wherein a number of states came together and said that will not be part of any of the two blocks, the idea of non-aligned foreign policy was not the same, right? And Nehru in his parliamentary speech spoke at length about what this non-aligned foreign policy would mean, and that he said that it would not mean that we would not align with any of the actors at the world stage. I mean, given the interest that we would have, and given if our interests merge with any of the two blocks, at that moment we'll take the decision in our national interest and might align with those countries. If you look at it, the core principle of both strategic autonomy and non-aligned foreign policy was essentially the same. And therefore, I think people criticize that India faltered on its non-aligned policy when it went to the Soviets for help. But I think that was a semblance of India exercising its strategic autonomy at that point of time. And the answer to your second question, does India need it? I think yes, India needs it very much, because at the current juncture, India, like any other country, has multivariate interests, and there are issues-based cooperations wherein you might have a convergence with a certain country or a strategic partner or a very close strategic partner, but on certain issues you might have divergences with those same very partner, right? For example, the US, on climate change we might have divergences, but on security and defense we might have convergence. And as complex interdependence theory shows, that there are multivariate interests and there are overlapping interests that diverge and both converge, right? So that scenario, I think strategic autonomy is an essential tool to have to navigate this complex web of interdependence.
All right, that's fascinating. Yes, Bharat, if you have a question, please do let me know.
I think just, it is, I think, just a hypothetical kind of scenario. And I think just to kind of play the devil's advocate, I think if tomorrow India does kind of ally with the US, I was just wondering, what you think about this, Manoj? Would that kind of lead to better outcomes than a posture that indicates, yes, we'll work with others. We will kind of on whatever issues we care about, we will ally with whoever we want to. But I think, if we were to imagine India allying with one particular pole, let's say, most probably the US, let's say, what would that world look like? Do we actually think that, it would diminish our autonomy? Because, let's say, Just an example, I think if India was to ally with the US, China would think twice about doing anything at the line of actual control, because it would mean that you have US-China kind of competition escalating. You have more conflict as a result, because it does invite kind of obligations and commitments in that relationship. So you might say that, yes, the idea that, the idea of alliance is something that does have some kind of, force. Yeah, but just wondering what do you think about that?
So very briefly, I think that it would have to be a very, very different world in which India's threat perception would have had to have magnified far more than what it is today for India to enter into a formal alliance with the United States. Likewise, the flip side of that question is, I don't know what are the conditions that are necessary for the United States to put that offer on the table for India, because that offer is clearly not on the table right now. In terms of whether it would make India much more safe vis-a-vis China, perhaps, but I don't know. Is the Philippines safer? Is Japan safer today? Are countries in Europe safer because of the alliance? One could argue both ways, right? I could say yes, they are safer because we've not seen this Ukraine war become something bigger. It could easily become something bigger, and it's NATO and that alliance that keeps it at bay. The other side is that the presence of the alliance allows for different kinds of actions, which is what we are seeing, say, in the East and the South China Sea. So I wouldn't say that it would end or it would sort of, cease the nature of friction between India and China, but it would perhaps alter the nature a little bit. So yeah, I'm not sure if that would make India much more safer. And what would India give up in terms of its freedom of choices with regard to demands by the United States on specific issues is the other question, right? Say, for example, on Taiwan, on Xinjiang, on Hong Kong, would it require different kinds of thinking from India? On Iran, would it require different kinds of thinking? So I think it's, again, complex. So the costs, I don't think necessarily today clearly tell you that, and I'm talking formal alliance, not a deeper partnership that we're building. I think that's a positive. But a formal alliance, I think you need to do a much more detailed cost-benefit assessment to be able to say. And that can only be done when you think through scenarios of what India's threat perceptions would be. Yeah, so that's sort of my brief take. I said that I would avoid giving my takes on this conversation. But yeah, with that, I think we've already run out of much more time than I had planned for this thing. So we're going to wrap this conversation up. We've got some threads that we've been able to peel together. We've got some disagreements that we've very politely articulated with each other, which are probably things that we should discuss when we get into office and sit around a table. But at least we've gotten a sense of what we mean by these terms and how India has sort of conventionally thought about and how Indian policy has conventionally moved in this direction. One really interesting takeaway for me from this conversation has been that, we are today we discussed the different kinds of factors of power and that we need to be able to cultivate strategic autonomy. But it's fascinating how in the 1950s, where evidently India's power in terms of measurable hard power, whether it was economics, military, whatever, was far, far, far lesser compared to today. Yet we were able to exercise a significant amount of strategic autonomy in terms of our actions. There were costs to that, which to me is fascinating in terms of the relation of elements of power as a variable to exercising strategic autonomy. And I think to that, Bharat made this point about India being ideological in terms of its non-alignment. I may not necessarily entirely agree with the ideological commitment. I think it was also fairly pragmatic. In fact, that was one of my papers for my master's dissertation. So we can again talk about this in the office. But thanks so much, guys. This has been a really fascinating conversation. And I hope that the people listening, I hope if you're listening to this in the night, I hope you've had a good Independence Day. If you're listening to this in the morning, get out there for flag hosting and have a fun Independence Day. And let's think about the values that day means for all of us. One part of that is in terms of the foreign policy domain, the idea of India's place in the world and what strategic autonomy means to that. And we hope that we've at least provided you some sort of a flavor of the issues that surround this topic. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you, Manoj. Thank you for having us.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, If you'd like to dive into Takstashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.